Hello friends, welcome to Coding Garden with CJ. Welcome to the front-end showdown, the final battle. So in this episode, I am going to create the same app with vanilla JavaScript, React.js, Angular 6, and Vue.js. The main idea is to really see the different concepts implemented in all of these different frameworks. If you're watching live, please say hello in the chat. Hello, Riley. Welcome to the stream. Hello, Chad. Welcome to the stream. It's going to be a fun time. Thanks for joining. All of the apps are going to contact the 500 pixels API. It's an image search API that you can sign up for. This is it, 500px.com. They have lots of cool images. Like, you can search for really anything and get awesome results. I was trying earlier, like, Vue.js. Nothing. What if you search for like React.js? Interesting, like stock images. So yeah, this is what we're going to use. I'm not going to get into how I created the API key and things like that. I'll link to the sign up and docs in the description. I already have my API key ready to go. Mainly, this is going to be about actually building the app. I am also going to be using the Skeleton CSS framework. If you've never heard of that, let's get skeleton.com. Yes, this is it. So a dead simple responsive boilerplate. So this is a CSS framework, but it is very, very lightweight. If you've ever used something like Bootstrap, it's way, way lighter than that. You get styles by default, so you don't have to add classes to things. But if you want some classes or some different styles, you can add styles to get those. Like, yeah. And basically, I'm going to use this so our app looks decent by default. Hey, Emmy, welcome to the stream. Hey, Brooks. Brooks is asking, what is the build order? It is this order from left to right. I'm saving Vue.js for last, and I'm going to do my best to not be opinionated while I build these things. If you have watched my live stream before, you know that I love Vue.js, but yes, this is the order. First in vanilla, then in React, then in Angular, then in Vue. And this is kind of in the order of when they were introduced into the front-end framework web development scene. Vanilla.js has been there all along, but yeah, so I'm gonna use Skeleton, super simple styles. You just add it and it looks decent, so yeah. Other thing, I'll have a super basic body style, 80% width with margin on the side, automatic margin on the side, and 2 ems of margin on top, so just like a basic app. But the main thing is, when I build this app with all 3 different frameworks, these are kind of the core concepts that we're going to be demonstrating, and they're typically the things you do and need to do when you're building an app with a front-end framework. So the first thing is user input. We're going to have a search form. The next thing is DOM events. We're going to have like a submit handler on the form. Maybe eventually, if we get to it, we'll have like a click handler on the images. We are just getting started, but this is my break timer. So if you're watching from home and you've been sitting down a while, stand up for a second, take a quick stretch. This is going to be a fun time. I'm excited. And Chad is asking which version of Angular we'll be using. We're going to use version 6, which was released not too long ago. And I believe it's totally backwards compatible with Angular 5. But yeah, that's what we will be using. And if I have enough time, honestly, I might even do it with Angular 1x too, maybe at the end. Okay. Yeah, so we'll be using demonstrating DOM events. We'll be demonstrating API requests. For everything except for Angular, I'm just going to use fetch, which is built into the browser. Angular has its own built-in way of making API requests, so we'll use that. We'll show conditional rendering, so like if something is happening, show this, otherwise show this other thing. And we'll also be demonstrating rendering lists of data, which is a very common thing for you to do when you're building a front-end app. Here's the basic task list. So these are the things I'm going to do for every single app. I will add the search form to the page, make an API request with the search term when the form is submitted, show a loading image while we're getting the results, then append the results to the page, and then hide the loading image. Pretty simple, but it involves some things. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to do the same thing for every app, but I do have a list of like stretch features. So if we get all of this done fairly quickly, I would love to start implementing things. And the stretch features are paginate results. So by default, we're just going to request the first page of search results, but the API allows you to specify a page. So you can do like next or previous buttons. So maybe we'll add that. Then we could get into some more complex state management and maybe routing. So you could click on an image to add it to your favorites, and then there would be like a favorites page that you could go to, and you could navigate between the search and the favorites page. Question in the chat from Eric: how frequent are your breaks? So I use a tool called Time Out by Dejal. This, and you can configure it for however you want, but I have a 10-second micro break set up every 15 minutes, and then a 5-minute longer break every 60 minutes. But you can add as many micro breaks or longer breaks that you want to in this tool. And if you're on Windows, there's a tool called iLeo. It works in a very similar way. It basically does like a full screen overlay, so you are reminded to take a break. Okay, who's excited? Let's do this. Okay, first up is going to be vanilla JavaScript. So let's get started. In this folder, I will create a new directory. Let's call it vanilla. And inside of there, we'll create a file called index.html. And it is important to note, I'm not going to be using any JavaScript library. So everything I do is built into the browser and will work without any libraries. Only library I'm using is the CSS framework to get some basic styles. So let's do an HTML5 page. Yeah, cool. And the title will be vanilla image search. Vanilla.js. Emoji. Whoa. Wrong thing. That's the wrong thing? How do you do an emoji? There we go. I want the ice cream cone. Vanilla. Cool. So this is bringing in some styles. Let's create a style file called main.css. And that's just where we're going to add our basic body style. And then we need to bring in the skeleton CSS framework. So that's just as simple as adding the link in the head there. And then let's create a JavaScript file. So at the bottom of the body, I'm going to add a script source. We'll call this main.js. And then in this folder, we'll create main.js. Cool. Let's just log that it's working. Hello world. And we'll add like a basic h1 with this title. Whoa, now. I'm still getting used to VS Code. I've been using Atom forever. Okay. Let's make sure that our main styles are loaded after the CSS framework. Okay, so now I'm going to go into, I believe this is image search. And then in the vanilla folder, cool. Steve says he loves code. I love code too. Cool, so we're in that folder that I just created, and I'm going to use a tool called Light Server. It's an auto-refreshing dev server, so anytime you change a file, it'll automatically refresh the browser. You can install that from npm if you do npm install-g light server. You could probably also use the npx command. I've had it installed forever, so I'm just going to use the light server command. So that starts up a server running on port 3000. Our page looks decent. If we look at the DevTools, we get a hello world and favicon not found, but that's okay. So hello world, basic app, we're up and going. So the first task is to add a search form to the page. So let's do that. So right below the H1, let's add a form, no action because we're going to handle it with JavaScript. And inside of here, we need a label. This will be for the search term. Below that, we need an input. Type is text. ID will be search term. And the name will be search term. Cool. And below that, I'll add a simple little button that says search. What do we got? Cool, basic page. If we look at skeleton CSS, there's a way to make a full width form or a full width input. This U full width. So on the input, we'll give it the class full width. And there we go. Nice little search form. Okay. Search form complete. Back to the README. We have added that to the page. Now make an API request with the search term when the form is submitted. So first, let's tap into the form submitted event. So on this button, we'll give it a type of submit. And then in JavaScript, we're going to add the event listener for the submit event. So in here, first I'm going to get the form, store that in a variable. I'm going to use query selector and say grab the first element on the page that has the form tag. Cool. And then we want to tap into that submit event, so we can do form.add event listener. We're listening for the submit event, and I'll just define a function called form submitted. So below that, we'll have a function. We'll call it form submitted. This will take in the event. And for now, let's just log that event. Cool. So if I say hello world and then submit the form, you'll notice it clears out and the page refreshes. That is because by default in the browser, a form tries to send the data somewhere. We don't want that to happen because we want to handle it with JavaScript. So we need to prevent the default action. So on the form, do event.prevent default. Cool. And now we should see the event logged. So submit the form. Cool, we're seeing the event. Let's grab the search term from the page. So let's say search term is, and I'm just going to store the input in a variable. So let's say input is document.querySelector. Grab the thing on the page, the first tag on the page that is input. Cool. And then we can get what's inside of that input just using input.value. And then let's just log out what the search term is that the user entered. Okay, so if we search for puppies, puppies logs to the console. So we're grabbing whatever the user enters and logging it to the console. Now we need to make an API request. So I want to have a function that says like search. You pass in the search term. So let's define a function called search. Takes in the search term. And then we're going to use fetch. So it's built into all modern browsers, and it's essentially the replacement for XML HTTP requests. But it's pretty simple and easy to use. You say fetch. You specify what URL you want to make the request against. I have that stored in here. And this has my API key inside of it. I might be able to get away with calling it without showing you my key, but I'm still going to revoke the key after the stream and upload all this code. Break timer. It's a short one. Take a quick stretch. Take a sip of any beverage you might have nearby. I'm drinking yerba mate, classic gold. Oh, my green screen's doing weird things with it. Cool. Okay, so we have that URL. Let's store that in a variable. Equals that. Cool. Oh, already grabbed that. So now that we have the URL, when we fetch, we're going to make a request to that URL, and then on the query string, we need to add and term equals, and then we'll throw the search term on the end there. And actually, even before we make this request, let's just log, well, I was going to say log the URL out, but I don't want you to see my API key. Actually, it doesn't matter. I'm going to revoke it anyways. Okay, so before we do this, let's just say URL is equal to that, and then we'll log out the URL. And we should see the full URL with our search term on the end of it. So if I search for puppies, okay, it's hiding my API key. Cool. So full URL, and then on the end, it has term equals puppies. Yeah, so that's working. Let's actually make the request. So we throw in the URL, and the way fetch works is it's promise based. So you say .then, you get access to the response object, and there are various methods to deal with the response. I know that this API returns JSON, so I can do response.json. That also returns a promise. And when that is done, we should get some result. And let's just log that result out to make sure we're getting some data back from the API. Kittens, go. Cool, so we're getting back some results. We've got a photos array. Each one has some data inside of it. Inside of there, we have an image URL. Let's see what we get. Oh, cool. So API request is working. Let's check that off. So user types in a search term, dogs. They submit the form. We make the API request. We then log the data to the console. All right, making progress. Next thing is show a loading image while this is happening. I found this GIF earlier. Works better than anything else, so I'm going to use this. So basically, while we're fetching the results, we're going to show this image, and then when the results come back, we are going to hide this image. So let's do this. On the page, let's just throw the image there. Source is going to be that. And let's just add a basic 100% width image style. Cool. So by default, yeah, the loading image is there. But when the page loads, we don't want to show that just yet. So let's hide it when the page loads with JavaScript, and then we'll show it when we make the API request. So let's give this an ID of loading image. And then in my JavaScript, I'll store that in a variable. Document.query selector. We'll pass in the thing with the ID loading image. Cool. And the moment the page loads, we'll just say loading image.style.display is none. So when the page loads, it's gone. Cool. But when we start fetching results, we want to remove that. So the moment we start the fetch, we will set display to nothing, which should show it on the page. So now if I say puppies search, it shows the image. Now we'll get back the results, we'll add them to the page, and then hide the image. Amy says she likes that I am searching for cute images. Me too. Okay, so we're hiding the loading image. Well, we're showing it when the API request happens. Now let's append the results to the page. So for that, we need to figure out what we need. So result is this entire object. Photos is the array. So I want to iterate over that for sure. But let's do this inside of a function. So here's what I'm going to do. This promise is going to return result.photos. So this will return just the array. And then we'll return this fetch from the search function. So by returning it, now search returns a promise. So I can do something like search.then display images. And then I can define a function called display images that will actually add them to the page. So let's do that. Display images that gets in the images. For now, let's just log them out, make sure that this chain of promises is actually working. So form is submitted, search function is called. The search function returns a promise that will eventually have that array of photos. When that is done, it'll invoke display images, which gets access to that array, and then we log it out to the console. So should still work. Hamsters. Cool, so it's working, but now notice we're not logging the whole object, we're just getting that one array of photos. That reminds me, I'm thinking about getting a beta fish, and then like while I stream, I'll have him or her in the corner, just kind of like floating around. I don't know. I'm probably gonna do that. Okay, so we want to iterate over these images. So we can do images.forEach image. And let's just log the image out. We need to figure out what's the path to get to that URL. So if we search for beta fish, so if we look at one of these, it has an image URL property, which is an array, and we want the first one. So I should be able to do image.image URL at 0. That should give me the images. Cool. So now we're getting direct links to those images. Ooh, that's a pretty one. I was watching a YouTube video earlier of how to train a beta fish. They're like really smart. It'd be awesome. I was thinking I could do something where I teach the beta fish tricks, and then in like the live chat, you can do something, and I'd have some sort of like Internet of Things to make the fish do a trick or something. I don't know. I might do that. That'd be fun. Okay, so we're grabbing the image URLs. Now we actually want to add some images to the page. So in my HTML, I'm going to make a little X marks the spot. Let's say just a section, and it will have a class of images. And in my JavaScript, let's grab that element up at the top. Image section will be document.querySelector. Grab the thing on the page that has the class images, and this is what we're going to be appending to. Yeah, so let's do this. We will first create an image element. So const image element. That's going to be document.createElement, and we want to create an image tag. And then we want to set the source of that image to be this URL. So image element.source will be this. Wait. Yeah. Just making sure I didn't name my variable something conflicting. Hey Kaizen, welcome to the stream. Okay, so we're going to set the source on the image to be that URL. And then we're going to append this image to the images section. Images section dot append child image element. Okay, let's see what happens. Puppies. It worked. Cool. They're so happy. That's not a puppy. Dan is asking, did he miss one? No, this is the first one. This is vanilla JavaScript. And when I'm finished, I will review the code that I just wrote and kind of talk about what I did. Comfy in the chat is asking what order am I building it in? It should be the same order as the video description. Vanilla first, which is what I'm working on now, then React, then Angular 6, then Vue, and if I have enough time and if anybody wants to see it, I might actually do Angular 1, 2. Cool. Moss, welcome to the stream. Hello. Cool. So images are on the page. That's fantastic. Let's hide this image. First, let's check off in our README. So we appended the results to the page. Now we want to hide the loading image after we got back the results. So here, after we append everything, we'll set loading image back to display none. Okay. Search for kittens. Go. Hey, it worked. Look at that. That looks like a wildcat or something. I don't know. Cool. Let's just add some basic styles. I was doing some nerds. I was doing some. I was reading the chat just now. I'm not calling you a nerd. You're great. But I was doing some research last night. Watch this. Watch how easy it will be to make this like a 3-column layout. I literally did not know this existed until last night, and it has been around for a very long time. So images is our image container, and I'm going to do column count 3. So now by default, the container will be 3 columns. The interesting thing is I believe it goes like in this order, like instead of across, but still we get like a masonry like layout if you've ever heard of that. Dogs. Look at that. And it's fully responsive. That's awesome. Cool. I think we did it. We did vanilla JavaScript. Kaizen just said in the stream, if everyone watching right now shares this live stream with 10 friends and we have a 50% success rate, this channel will have 1,000 subs. Thank you so much, Kaizen. Kaizen has been here since the beginning. He's awesome. But I'm getting up there. It's exciting. The other day, I was watching Coding Train, and I sponsored his stream, and he actually knew who I was. I was freaked out, but he mentioned my name, and then I got tons of subscribers after that. But I'm almost to 1,000. I did say when I get to 1,000 subscribers, I'm gonna do like an 8-hour stream, like build some full stack app with as many features as possible, code all day long. Of course, I'll take breaks for lunch and stuff like that. But yeah, when I get to 1,000, it's gonna be fun. Emmy's asking, what is this skeleton thing? So I'm using a basic CSS framework to get like the basic styling for the form. It's called Skeleton CSS, a dead simple responsive boilerplate. If you're familiar with like Bootstrap or Materialize, it's like that, but smaller and a lot simpler. Like it adds default styles instead of having to add classes to everything. And then they do have some classes available, and they have a built-in 12-column grid system. Awesome. Okay. Yeah, I think we did. We did vanilla JavaScript. Yay. Let me get my soundboard. Let's cheer. Crowd cheer. Thank you. Okay. Oh, and Emmy is asking the image tiling. The thing I Googled was CSS masonry layout. So if you've never heard of masonry, it's a library for a layout where, so you'll notice like, typically, if you're trying to do like columns across, like there would be lots of white space in here. But the way this column count works is it puts them from the top down, and then I believe it goes back up like this. So by doing that, you get like a really cool, almost like Pinterest style layout, just automatically in the browser. I think you can do similar things with Flexbox. There's some caveats and similar things with CSS Grid. And yeah, and if you Google masonry layout, there are actually libraries that will do it. Yeah, and this was the problem I was talking about. Like if you do it across, then you end up with a lot of white space. There's jQuery masonry, yeah, and a few different libraries. But this the way I'm doing it is just column count 3. And that's just a CSS property that has existed for a very long time. If we look at it on MDN, but I was reading an article from like 2014 that talked about using this thing, so it's pretty sweet. Brooks is saying, when I do my giant stream, I can maybe stream devs live or show videos of interviews to take breaks. Totally, that would be super fun. I want to make it an event. Like I almost want to like live stream myself cooking breakfast or something like that. I don't know who would want to watch that, but I think it'd be fun. And then Comfy in the chat asks, how come you chose to stream on YouTube and not Twitch? And was it to keep all of your content in one place? This is my break timer, so if you're watching from home, take a quick stretch or stand up out of your chair. Yes, mainly I'm streaming on YouTube to keep my content in one place, and then also I've found I get a lot more like organic subscribers. Like people will get suggested to my channel just by watching other coding channels like Fun Function or Traversy Media because my content is similar. And on Twitch, you don't really get recommended channels like that. So I have tons of people that have just found me because YouTube recommended them to me. I've considered streaming on Twitch and then uploading to YouTube. But the other thing is, like, when I go live, if people have similar interests to like tags of my videos and stuff like that, YouTube will actually show them, hey, this person is live. So I've found it gets a lot more traction by using YouTube instead. Yeah, it is something to consider. Actually, I streamed a few times on Twitch before, and I had maybe 2 viewers. I didn't do much advertising, but it was harder for people to find me. Okay, I've been talking a lot. but we did it with vanilla JavaScript. Let's just review the app real quick. What does it do? And then we'll get on to using React. So you load the page, basic search form. You can search for something. You submit the form. We see the loading image, and then the images come back. Oh, one thing I think we should fix, though. If I search for something new, the existing images are still there. Yeah, they're not updating. So one thing I need to do is when we do another search, clear out the existing images so that the puppies got appended to the bottom. Yeah. So let's just do this. Whenever we display images, we'll set the image section dot inner HTML to be nothing. And that will clear out the previous results so the new results will show up. And actually, we should clear them out when we start doing a search here. Because when we see the loading image, we want all those other images to go away. Okay, let's try it now. So if I search for kittens, cool, and beta fish, ooh, yeah, beta fish are awesome. I'm gonna get a beta fish. I definitely am. Cool. So we have a working vanilla app. Let's review what I did in the code, and let's check off this last one, hide loading image. So our HTML, we're bringing in the skeleton CSS library. That's there. We're bringing in our CSS with just a few basic rules. So the body has a little bit of space on the side, a little bit of margin on top. The images container has a column count of 3. And then any image on the page takes up 100% width. So these two styles are actually playing together because this says a 3-column layout, an image will take up 100% of that column, and then it flows from in this direction. I think that makes sense. And so that's how they actually show up on the page. And then in the HTML, we have a basic form, we have an input, and then we have a button that has a submit handler. So in the JavaScript, we tap into the submit event of the form and then make the request. Below that, we have our loading image. That's this thingy. What else should I search for? Gerbils. Look at them. But the purpose of doing that was to show you that loading image. So when you search, you see that loading image for a split second, and then things start to pop up. There must be a mountain range named hamsters. That's interesting. Okay, but that we conditionally hide and show, and then the section here has all of the images inside of it. And then we just have one JavaScript file. Up at the top, we're storing the API URL. This is where we're actually making the request to. We're storing all of our variables, so we have the form, the input the user is typing into, the image itself, and then the section. So I'm storing all of these up here, so if I need to use them multiple times, I can just use that variable. Then when the page loads, we hide the loading image, and then we listen for the submit event, of the form. And when the form is submitted, this form submitted function is called. We prevent the default action to prevent the page from refreshing. Then we grab the search term from that input, and then we call our search function, which actually calls the API. So we pass in the search term there. That constructs the URL, which is the full API URL with the search term on the end of it. We show the loading image, and we clear out any of the existing results if there were any there. Then we call the API using the built-in fetch, parse the response as JSON, and then return the array of photos that was in that response. This function returns a promise, so we dot then that promise up here, and when this is finished, we call display images. Display images just iterates over the images, creates an image element for each one, sets its source, and then appends it to the page. And then we hide the loading image. And actually, it might make sense to do something like this. So we could do display images dot then and have a simple little function that just does that. Mainly because your functions should really only do one thing. So searches the API. And actually, we could do the same thing with these. Let's put that in a small little function. Say like show let's say, let's call this function search start. So when we start searching, we want to show the loading image and hide the existing results. And then we'll just call that function right before we call search. Cool. Emmy is asking what will be the name of my fish. I was thinking QWERTY. My brother has a dog named QWERTY, but if you ever watch the show Mr. Robot, he has a fish named QWERTY. It's not that original, but I really like that name. RV said, this became my favorite channel out of nowhere. Awesome. I appreciate that, RV. I'm doing my best. I'm putting my content out there. All I can hope for is people watch me and like me. I don't know. But yeah, that's our app. We submit the form, we make the search, we display the images. This is vanilla JavaScript. Now, I'm not using any sort of state management pattern, and when we're working with front-end frameworks, you typically have some sort of state management. Like, you don't just store your state in the DOM, because we're essentially like storing this array of images in the DOM itself, whereas when I'm using React, that's just going to stay inside of an array. Same thing with Angular and Vue. And it's one of the major differences between vanilla JavaScript and these other front-end frameworks is really the separation of concerns, whereas JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript, everything is kind of just mixed in here, unless you decide to format your code in more of that style. And then the other frameworks kind of force you to separate out your data from your presentation. But okay, we did it. How long have I been streaming? 38 minutes? Cool. So we're done with vanilla JavaScript. Let's get into React.js. Yes, React. Here. So for this, I'm going to use the create React app command. So let's do that. I'll kill the server that's running in vanilla. Go up to my image search directory, and then create React app will create a new directory for me. So I will do that. I'm going to do npx create React app and put it in a folder called React. React cannot create a project called React, so let's do React image search. It's happening. Okay, cool. And the thing about Create React app is it's from Facebook, and Facebook also published Yarn, which is kind of the same thing as NPM. There are some differences, but they work in a similar way. And so if the Create React app detects that you have Yarn on your system, it actually automatically does a Yarn install instead of an NPM install. And then we can do a Yarn start. So let's close out all these other things. And in my React folder, we can see what got generated. There are a few different scripts we can use. We can start up the app. We can build it for being deployed. We can run tests. And then eject will take all of the hidden configuration like Webpack and things like that and actually put it in the folder so you can customize it. The source directory actually contains your React code. Index.js is the Webpack entry point. We bring in the React library. Their default Webpack config has a CSS importer, so we can import that in. We're bringing in our app component. And then it has some built-in code for like caching the files with a with a service worker. And then this is the code right here that kind of adds our app to the page. So what you're looking at here, if you've never seen React before, is JSX. It's essentially HTML inside of our JavaScript. So what we're saying is render this app component, which we defined in this file, on the element that has the ID root. And if we look in our public folder, index.html has that one div right there. So essentially, our entire React app will live on that one div. Cool. While we're in here, let's go ahead and add the CSS framework. So let's grab this link to skeleton. In our index.html, inside of the head, we'll throw the CSS file there. And that should be good. Actually, before I do that, let's show what we get by default with Create React app. So in this directory, if I do a yarn start, I have to go into React image search and then do a yarn start. That'll start it up. This was the my previous app. It's running on the same port, but the other one's closed. But by default, you get this super basic React app. It has this cool little animated image. Welcome to React. And edit source app.js to get started. So for all three of the front-end frameworks I used tonight, I'm going to do everything inside of one component just to keep it simple. If I have time at the end, I might talk about how to break that out into separate components. But I really just want to demonstrate the concepts of like user input and list rendering in just one component for now. So if we look in the source directory, it says all of our code. I showed you the entry point index.js. This brings in index.css. Let's just get rid of default styles for now. Actually, we can bring in the styles that we want. We want these in our index.css. Cool. And then we want to bring in skeleton in index.html. And then if we look at app.js, this is our React component. So we're bringing in React in component from the React library. Their default Webpack config allows you to import images as well. So they're just importing a SVG image. We get rid of that. And then they're importing a CSS file, which might be CSS that's specific to just app, the app component. Let's see what's in there right now. Yeah, a lot of stuff. I really don't want any of this, so I'm gonna get rid of that. And then I'm also gonna get rid of the import. We just have some basic styles at the top level. Dan is asking side chatter. Anyone ever just see just .jsx files containing the React code? Yeah, and I believe you can actually name this .jsx and it will still work. Yeah, so I named that .jsx. The app failed to compile. Oh, and then in the import, I might have to actually specify .jsx. Logo is not defined. Oh, and then the render is trying to use that logo that I got rid of. Let's get rid of that. Let's get rid of all of this and just have an h1 inside of our component for now. React image search. So I think this should work, Dan. Basically, the Webpack loader has a rule that says if you see a .jsx file, treat it like a JavaScript file. And the Webpack loader automatically, I believe, looks for JSX inside of other JavaScript files if there might be some. Yeah, so this is still compiling and it's working, totally. So it's just a convention, and it's probably just a convention to let other developers know that, hey, this file has JSX inside of it. I'll leave it that way because why not? Okay, but what we're seeing here is our basic app component. This is what's getting rendered into that div with the ID root. It has just a basic h1. And you'll notice here we're saying class name. And the interesting thing about JSX is it's inside of JavaScript, so you can't use reserved words from JavaScript. So the class keyword means something in JavaScript. It means you're creating like an object-oriented class. So in your JSX, if you want to specify a class name, you have to use the word class name. I don't want that at all. Let's get rid of that. Okay. First order of business, let's add the search form to the page. I am going to cheat and just grab the form that we created with vanilla. It's going to look exactly the same, but we'll have to hook it up. So right below the H1, I'm going to throw this form. And the other reserved word is for, because in JavaScript, you typically are writing a for loop. So if you want to use for, like on a label, you have to use HTML4. This is my break timer. Let's take a quick stretch. Welcome, Chris, to the stream. Late to the party, but we're just getting started with React. Just finished vanilla, starting React now. Angular after that. Okay, so we can't use for because that's a reserved word, so we have to say HTML4. Cool. So that gives us a label. We have our input. The other interesting thing about React is all elements must close themselves. So regular HTML doesn't care because an input is a self-closing tag, but in React you have to actually close that tag like that for it to work. And actually, let me show you what error we get if I don't do that. Failed to compile. Expected corresponding JSX closing tag for input. So the JSX parser knows that this is a self-closing element. You have to actually close it. Cool. So we got our basic form inside of React. Let's check a box. Add the search form to the page. All right, update state when input changes. So before I do that, I'm just gonna put the actual title of the page in the constructor inside of state. Chris is asking, why do I prefer Vue? I will definitely talk about that when I get to Vue. I don't want to spoil the party. And really, I at that point, I'll have two apps to compare. Like, this is how I did it with Vue. This is how I did it with React. This is why I prefer to do it with that way. But stay tuned, or come back later. All right, so we want a constructor. In React, your constructor must invoke super, because this class inherits all of the properties of the component class. So this is like an object-oriented concept. Basically, by calling super, we're calling the constructor of the component class. So all of the default behavior happens. Then I'm going to define my state. And your state is just an object, a JavaScript object with the different things that you want to represent in the view. So in this case, I want a title on my state, and I want that to be a string that has that value inside of it. And now that I have this state, I want to use this state inside of my render function. So the way that works is use curly braces, and you say this.state dot whatever property you want. In this case, I want title. So works exactly the same way, but if we, okay. If we update the title, you'll actually see that we are grabbing that from state, right? So this is one of the core concepts in front-end frameworks is you take all of the data of your app and you put it in one place, your state, and then your view is just a representation of that state. So this basically says whatever title may be, please put it inside of this H1. So we're doing that. However, what we want to do is update the state when the input changes. So if we think about the state of this application, even what the user is typing in here, that is considered state because the page itself is changing, and so we should keep track of that. So on my state, I also want a search term. And when the page first loads, search term is totally empty. And now we want to use this state inside of our render function. So for that, I am just going to say value equals this.state.search term. Cool. And just because I've used two different properties from state, I'm going to use destructuring. So that's just a way of grabbing properties off of an object in a cleaner fashion. So I want title and search term, and I want to grab those from this.state. And now I can just say title here and search term here. Okay, so what this is saying is when the page renders, like when this gets put into the DOM, the value of the input will be the value of search term. Great, so when the page loads, it's totally empty. But as the user types, we want to update that to be the latest value of what the user typed. So for that, we need to listen for the change event of the input. So I'm going to say onChange is going to be a function, and, well, I spelled that wrong. onChange. And we'll say this dot search term changed. Cool. Getting some really weird syntax highlighting. What am I doing wrong? I don't know. Okay. So basically we're saying when the input changes, call this function. So now we need to define this, and we're just going to put this as a method on our class. Search term changed. That takes in the event. And for now, let's just log. I think VS Code has totally crapped out. Let me quit VS Code because my autocomplete is not working right now. Okay. I found that I have to do this every now and then. Like if I've been running VS Code for a while, it starts to act really weird. Okay. Please autocomplete log. Thank you. Okay, that was weird. And we're just going to log the event. So whenever the search term changes, log the event to the console. Let's open our DevTools. Let's throw this down there. Invalid DOM property class. Did you mean class name? Why, yes, I did. So on the input, I believe I'm using a class from Skeleton, so we need to update that. So class should be class name. Cool. All right, so when the input changes, we should see that event logged. So type, we see the event log. But notice nothing is actually showing up in the UI in value because it's bound to state, right? And we have not updated state yet. So this event has a target. The target is the element itself, and believe there's a value property. I don't know if we can see it in the DevTools, but if I log event.target.value, this will be the value of the input because that's the target of this event. So I'm typing a letter. You'll notice that it's one letter at a time and it's not actually updating anything. So now I want to update state. We will run into an issue though. So the way you update state in React is this dot set state. You pass in an object, and then you tell it which property on state you want to update and give it a value. So I want to update search term, and I want to set that to event.target.value. Whoa, whoa. Cool. But this won't work. Let's see what the error is, and then we'll talk about why this won't work. So what's the error? Cannot read property set state of undefined. So essentially, it's saying I'm trying to call set state, but the thing on the left-hand side is undefined. Inside of this function, this is undefined. So if I were to log this, undefined. So by default, when you bind an event to a method, it has no this value. So I want this method to have the this value of the instance of the component. There's a few different ways to do it. I could actually bind this in line. I could say bind this value to the value of the component, of the instance. This will work. So that's working. The other way to do it is to use a fat arrow function, because a fat arrow function has a lexical this, meaning it doesn't change the value of this. So if I do a fat arrow or an arrow function, and then I invoke this with event, now because I'm invoking this event with a fat arrow, lexical this means use the this around where this thing is, and the this around there is the component instance itself. So now when that function gets invoked, this will be the component. And you notice state is actually updating and showing the latest value on the page. Whoa, whoa. Kaizen is saying pretty reactive. Is that a pun or a dig on it? Because it isn't as awesome as Vue. It is reacting to change though, right? So and the way this is working under the hood is, so we're saying on change, call this search term change function. So this gets called. And then when we call set state, that's going to update the underlying state. And then it's going to call our render function again and get back a new virtual DOM tree. I haven't talked about that or what it is, but basically it's a in-memory representation of what should be on the page. So we update state, it calls render, and then it says, okay, let's look at what was on the page last time versus what we just got back from the render function, and then update those things on the page. So that's what's happening. We call this event, we set the state, it updates state, and then this re-renders. Search term now has the latest value from state, and then that gets added to the page. Cool. So we are updating state when input changes. Cool. Now let's make an API request with the search term when the form is submitted. Cool. For this, because we're using Babel and Webpack and we can do imports, I'm actually going to define my API requests in a separate file, really just for modularity. So in source, let's create a new file. Let's call this api.js. let's just export an object. Well, yeah, we'll export an object, export default object, and this object will have a search function that takes in a search term and then makes a request to the API. I'm going to cheat again and just grab what we did with vanilla JavaScript because it'll be very similar. So we basically want to do this, and then we also need the API URL inside of React. Cool. Kaizen in the chat is saying he was going to say something more harsh, but React is like that friend you mock but still need. Yeah, I mean, it has its purpose. That's why people use it. Vue and I chill much easier. Cool. All right. So we have this basic search function. We have our API URL. We construct the URL using the search term that was sent in, and then we're just returning that array of photos. What is this complaining about? Parsing error, import and export may only appear with source type module. Did I put this in the wrong folder? I didn't. Oh, well, let's try it. So I defined api.js in this file. Let's attempt to import it into this file. So in here, I'm going to say import API from relative directory, just the API file. Okay, so now we're bringing that into our component, and now we need to listen to the submit event of the form to actually call the API. So our button has type of submit, so now on the form we want to listen for on submit. We're going to do a very similar thing as we did with on change, so we're just going to use an arrow function so we don't have to bind this. So that accepts the event, and we'll say this dot form submitted, pass in the event, and then we need to define that form submitted method, and we will do that here. This accepts in the event. We want to prevent the default action just like we did with vanilla.js, so event.prevent default. And then we want to make the API request. So I want to do api.search. I'll pass in this.state.search term because search term has been updated under the hood every time the input changes. So when this form submitted gets called, we're going to have the latest value of search term. We'll call the API. We'll do that. And then we will get back the images. And for now, let's just log those to the console, make sure we're actually getting them. So if we search for puppies, there they are. So we're actually calling the API when it's submitted. That's great. Let's look at our task list. So we're making the API request. Now we want to show the loading image while the API request is happening. So again, we want to represent this on state. So on our state, we're going to say loading. We'll initialize that to false because when the page loads, we're not contacting the API. We're doing nothing. So that's initially false. Then whenever the form is submitted, I want to set loading to true. So this.setState loading is true. And now let's use loading inside of our render function to show that loading image. Let's grab that from our vanilla that we did. This. So let's do it right below the form. Whoa. Gotta grab that again. Okay. Copy. Wait, no, not that. Copy. And then right below the form, we'll add the loading image. We can get rid of the ID. We don't need that in React. But now we want to conditionally render this. And I'm getting, again, that unterminated JSX contents. Image in regular HTML is a self-closing tag, but in JSX, you have to add the closing tag. So yeah, now by default, it's showing on the page when it loads. Let's update our CSS real quick. We want our images to have a width of 100%. Cool. And now let's show it. So I also want to grab loading from my state, and to decide whether to show this or not, we just use a ternary statement. So we'll say, if loading, then show me that loading image. Otherwise, show me nothing. So now when the page loads, it's not there. Image elements must have an alt prop, either with meaningful text or an empty string for decorative images. Okay, let's just give this an alt prop of loading. Okay, so now when I make the request to the API for kittens, we see loading, and then now we'll have to set it to false so that it disappears. So let's look at our README. We're showing a loading image when we're making the request. Now let's append the results to the page. So if we think about it, we need something on state to represent those results. So now state is going to have an images property that initially is just an empty array. So when the page loads, there are no images. And then when we get back the images, we want to set those on our state. So we'll just do this.setState, and we want images to be the value that we just got back from the API. So now under the hood, we're actually setting the value. I think I have React Dev Tools. Yeah, I do. So we can actually see them without showing them on the page. Yeah, so now if we look in the React Dev Tools, let's see. We can see our state, the current values of our state, and we can also see that the images array is now actually on our state. So that's a good thing. Cool. And now we actually want to show those images on the page. And actually, let's go ahead and set loading to false. And if you want to set multiple things at the same time, you just throw them inside of this object. So when we get back the images, set loading to false, and update the images on state. Now, if we want to show those images, let's add a section, give it a class of images, and for that, we just use a good old map. So I also want to grab images from state, and now inside of here, I want to map over those images to show an image for each one. So I'm going to say images.map. It's going to give me back an image. And then I want to return an image with the source set to the URL of the image. And if I remember correctly, image.image URL at 0. Cool. So the way this works is images is an array. When the page first loads, can I... let's go to console. So those are behaving weirdly. I am getting an error. Oh yeah, so this needs to be class name. All right, it's my break timer. Let's take a quick stretch. Whew. And this is telling me I also need to give this image a value. So let's look inside of that object and see if there's like a title of the image. Oh, it's working. But let's go into the React tools. And on any given image, it has a description. Does it have a title? No, we'll use description as the alt text. And the way alt text work is, if for whatever reason the image doesn't load, it'll show the text instead. And then also for like screen readers, for like somebody who's blind trying to use the website, it will read the alt text to them so they know that there's an image on the screen. So the alt text I want to set to be image.description. Cool. I was getting another error in the console. You'll also notice, so And to take a step back, what's actually happening here is when the page loads, images is an empty array. So it'll still attempt to do the map, but there's actually no data inside of it, so nothing displays. But when we actually get results, it sets that array, and now it maps over them and shows them on the page. The error I'm getting right now is each child in an array or iterator should have a unique key prop. This has to do with the fact that React is using the virtual DOM, and it needs to differentiate between all the different things in that array. So let's give it a key. Let's see what other properties we have on this image. Does it have ID? Yeah, let's use ID, because I know, or it should be, ID should be unique for every image, and so that should work as our key in the iteration. So each image needs a key that is image.id. Cool. So we're going to search for kittens. It's working. Cool. And let's go ahead and add that column count style just so we get some columns. So the images section needs a column count of 3. And then we get that. It's pretty cool. Awesome. So that is React. Let's review what we just wrote there. And I believe it has fully working functionality. Like if I actually no, we need to clear out the array whenever we first start to get the results. So like if I search for mountains, you'll notice the previous results stay there. So when we're setting state for loading, let's also set images to be an empty array. So the moment the form is submitted, by setting this to an empty array, it's going to clear out the previous results so that they're not still on the page. So if we search for mountains, and then if we search for beta fish, yep, they're not there. Cool, we did it with React. All right, let's review what we did and check some boxes. So we are appending the results to the page, and then we are hiding the loading image after everything has loaded. Cool. So let's review what we did there. First, we have our app component. It has state. And when you're building a React app, anything that changes, anything that the user is interacting with, that should be represented on state. And so our state has a title, a search term, that is what the user is typing in, loading, that's whether or not to show the loading image, and then the images array, which is the data we're getting back from the API. The render function is what's actually being displayed on the page. We're grabbing all of those values out of state using destructuring so that we can use those values in our render function. We show the title up top. We then have a form. It has an input. This is where the user is typing in. And as they're typing, we want to keep track of everything that they type. So we're listening to onChange. And then we have our method, search term changed, that updates state every time they enter a new key into the input box. So if we look at search term changed, essentially every new key that gets put into that input box, we update state under the hood, and then the app will re-render. It's smart enough to only update the things that changed, and that's this idea of the virtual DOM, but that's what's happening there. And then we're setting the value to be whatever search term is on state. So search term changes, update search term, re-render, value now has the latest value. Then when the form is submitted, we call our form submitted event. We first prevent the default action. We then set state to have loading true, so that will show the loading image, and we clear out the images array just in case there were any previous results. If you look in the UI, there is this ternary statement here that decides whether or not to show that loading image. So basically it says, if loading is true, show the loading image, otherwise show nothing. And then lastly, we have our section where we display all of our images. And to display those, we use a map function because it's just an array. So we say map over this array. And for each image, I want to create an image tag where the source is the source of that image and its description and its ID. When we submit that form, we call our API with the search term from state. We defined our API just in a separate file, but it's basically just doing a fetch request against that URL. and then we get back the array of photos. Once we get those back, we set them on state. Whenever we set state, the page re-renders, and then the latest values of images will get spit out onto the screen. We've done it. Neil in the chat says very lit. I agree. It's fun to do these things. Like while I personally don't prefer React, it's cool to see how these things work and really like how they structure the code. Because, and this is where let's compare this to how we were doing things with vanilla JavaScript. Oh, that's over there now. Cool. So in React, all of our state is in one place. In vanilla JavaScript, we don't really have any place where we're storing state. Like our state is stored in the DOM. Like the value of the input, that's coming from the DOM. When we add the images to the page, we're just storing them in the DOM. There is no render function. We're actually specifically grabbing elements and updating their contents. Whereas in React, we specify all of our UI in the render function, and it decides for us what it should update. There are some similarities though. So like we still have to prevent the default action when a form is submitted. We are defining our API call in a separate file. I guess the other thing is like conditional rendering. In React, that's as simple as a ternary statement to decide whether or not to show that loading image. In DOM manipulation, it's very explicit. We have to dive into the CSS property and say, hide the loading image or show the loading image here. Cool. That was fun. Any questions, thoughts, comments about React before I move into Angular 6, which is the one that I'm least familiar with, but it should still be a fun time. Cool. Did we check all the boxes? We did. All right. I'm going to take a quick stretch, and then we're going to get into Angular 6. All right. Anybody that's watching live, do you have a preferred front-end framework? Or are you just getting started on the front end? Actually, if you are watching live, please let me know what's the framework that you work in the most often? Or maybe the one you prefer the most. All right, let's use Angular. And for that, I am going to go to the Angular docs. Let's kill our server for now. Cool. Angular.io. And we can go into getting started. And this tells us how to use the CLI tool. So you can install it globally. I am just going to use npx. And then their CLI tool allows you to generate an app, just like we did with Create React App. But the Create React App is much more minimal than the Angular CLI. I was reading an article earlier today. Angular 6. Yeah. Their new CLI tool actually seems to have similar features to the Vue CLI tool. They now have a way of, ng add. So there are various plugins in the Angular ecosystem like Progressive Web App or Angular Material. And you can just do inside of an Angular app, ng add, and it will add that library automatically for you and hook it up and install it in all the different places. Cool. So let's look at the chat. Nicholas is learning React right now. Dan is doing React in Vue. That's awesome. Brooks mostly in React. Sadath is in React. Kaizen working in Vue most often. Rodrigo just started with JavaScript 3 months ago, and after looking at many frameworks review, I started to learn Vue right away. Looking awesome. It's glad to hear it. And Chad again is working in React. So the overwhelming majority of the people in the chat right now are using React. And some side chatter from Dan. React also changes rapidly. React 16, you don't need constructors on state. I think they're building in some built-in loading and context API. Yeah, I have heard about that. And there's like chatter that Redux will go away. So the app that I just built with React uses the built-in state management. A lot of times when you see a React app, it's actually using a thing called Redux, which is a separate library for managing state. And there is talk that in React 16, they've changed things up to where you may not need Redux anymore, and you may actually just be able to use the built-in context API to manage things. And Chris G says, React for some, and I'm converting him to Vue. Awesome. I wish they were paying me, but they're not. Actually, no, they don't need. Like, just use Vue. It's awesome. You don't got to pay me. It's awesome. But yeah, the Angular CLI tool has a lot of built-in features. It has generating, so you can run a command to generate an app. You can run a command to generate a new component. It puts it in all the right places and hooks everything up for you. So there's a lot going in. I would say of all of the frameworks I'm covering today, Angular is probably the heaviest, meaning it has the most things built in. And there's just a lot of different ways to do things. Well, not different ways. There's a lot to do. I'm going to stop trying to put that into words. Nicholas says he wants to learn Vue for some projects in the future. Absolutely. Do it. Okay. So yeah, Angular 6, I believe, was just released. Yeah, 10-ish days ago. And the CLI tool has all these new features. So we're going to use that CLI tool to generate the app. We need to create a new project. So again, this command will create the directory for us. So I'm going to do npx angular CLI new, and then the name of my app will be angular image search. Go. Actually, I forgot to eat dinner today. It's happened to me like 2 days in a row. For whatever reason, I don't know. So if you don't mind, I'm going to eat this while this installs. So I'll mute my mic so you don't got to hear me chewing. Kaizen says stay fed. I'll try. Cool. And Chad's eating string cheese. Kaizen says glucose fuels the brain. Absolutely. And Dan is saying if you're a React lover, JSConf has some cool React demos to check out with all that free time you have. And I'm sure you can probably find those on YouTube. All right, so we have generated an Angular app. Let's go into it. And let's look at the files we got. Let's close everything else. All right. Angular. In the directory, there's a lot going on. One thing to mention about Angular is it uses TypeScript. I think it's just worth mentioning like what is TypeScript real quick before I even dive into that Angular app. So TypeScript is it's a language that transpiles down to JavaScript, and you specify your types. So if you've ever worked in a strongly typed language like Java or C# or C++, when you define variables, you can't just say var. You have to say the type. So like int, string, boolean, variable name. And TypeScript essentially is a superset of JavaScript, meaning all of the existing features of JavaScript will work inside of it, but it adds things on top of it to give you type features. Quick start, not with Angular? Oh, no, not that. I just want to learn about TypeScript. TypeScript in 5 minutes. Cool. So essentially, let's look at the handbook real quick. Basic types. So it looks a lot like JavaScript, but you'll notice there are types. So instead of just doing let is done equals false, you have to actually say let is done, and then you specify the type of that variable. All of the primitive types in JavaScript have types built into TypeScript. So Boolean, number, string, null, undefined. Am I missing any? Probably. Object. But that's the interesting thing though. I'll show that in a second. So basically you're adding type descriptions to your code. And what that offers you is before you run your code in the browser, if you make a mistake, like you accidentally put the wrong type into a variable, or you also have to specify your types on function parameters. So if you attempt to call a function with the wrong types, the TypeScript compiler will yell at you. Basically, it's almost like a debugging tool. TypeScript is your friend to prevent you from making common mistakes that you might actually make in just plain old JavaScript. So you have your basic typing there. And there's also this idea of interfaces. So when you define an object in JavaScript, it can have any number of properties on it with any number of types. So an interface is basically a description of an object. So it says this object will have these properties, which will be of this type. And so labeled value will be an object that has a label property that is a string. Square config can be an object that has an optional color property. So the question mark says it may or may not have this property, and that property will be a string. Yeah, so there's that. They actually introduced, I think they introduced the class keyword before ES 2015 came out, but now it works in a very similar way. You can also do inheritance, but yeah, basically you're adding types to your code to get better errors before your code actually runs in the browser. And actually, I'll just show functions real quick because like by default, you got a function. However, the other thing about functions is you want to specify the types of your input, but you also want to specify the return type. So then your code knows that this function is returning a number. So if you're trying to store that in a variable, you can only put it in a variable that's been defined as a number. Yeah, so it's super interesting, and Angular uses that, so you're going to see a bit of that in the code that we look at now. Lots of configs up top. If you look in the source directory, this is where all your Angular code lives. A lot of stuff in here as well. If you look at main.ts, this is kind of like the entry point, the bootstrapping of the Angular app. We're bringing in lots of core packages that make stuff happen. And then we're bootstrapping the app module. And if we look inside of our app directory, there is app.module.ts. When you see .ts, that's TypeScript. And this is the setup of our app module. You can think of your module as kind of like a container for other components. I'm only going to have one component right now, but typically your app might consist of multiple modules. Like you might have the homepage module, the about page module, the search page module, and then all of those modules will live inside of the app module. So it really allows you to kind of like organize your code in that way. But this is the main app module, and it's bringing in the main app component. And if we look at app component, this is use class syntax to define your component. And you'll notice this selector value here. This basically says when you see this element on the page, it should load this app component. So if we look at our index.html, right here we have app root. And this is where the Angular app is going to get loaded into. Cool. You may notice that there is a ton of stuff going on. So there are lots of files imported. There are tons of files in the directory. There are lots of things happening here. This is a weird syntax you might not have seen before. This is essentially a decorator syntax. It allows you to, I believe it's like passing your class into a function to modify some of its properties. This was introduced ES 2017 or 2018, and also is a thing in TypeScript. Let's see if we can find it. Decorators. With the introduction of classes in TypeScript, there now exist certain scenarios that require additional features to support annotating and modifying classes and class members. Yeah, so when you see this syntax, it's a decorator. There is so much going on in this Angular app that I'm not even going to try to explain everything. I will try to explain the things that we come across and the things that are important. But if you do have any questions, please ask them in the chat. Like if I breeze over something that you'd maybe like explained a little bit more. Hey, Bob, welcome to the stream. Okay, so that's our app component. If we look at the definition, it has a property on it. And one thing about TypeScript is if you're defining a property, it infers the type from the right-hand side. So you could actually do, well, you could do this. But this has a built-in linting rule that says type string trivially inferred from a string literal, remove type annotation. So when it knows that this variable is a string, you don't have to put the type annotation on there. But you could think of this as our state on our component. There's a property on this component called title, and we get access to that inside of the view. The view is at this template in app_component.html. And did we start it up yet? No, we didn't. We can do npx serve. And so the serve command will open the Angular app in our browser. And yeah, we can see it, see the basics. Cool. So this is what we get by default. And the property on our component is actually getting loaded in right there. So if we look at the HTML, welcome to title. So Angular uses this syntax known as handlebars. And essentially it inside of the handlebars, you can specify some property on your component, and that's what will get rendered into the view. Yeah, I think that's it for the overview. Let's get rid of everything and start over. So we want an h1, and we want that to have our title. And our title is going to be Angular image search. So now by updating that, our page should just have an h1 on it. Awesome. So let's add our basic body style and CSS. So now in index.html, we're just going to add skeleton right there. Okay. And then we have styles.css. These are styles that get applied to your entire app. So here is where we're going to put that body style. Like that. And now we get our basic app with skeleton, and it has the title on the page. Cool. So what's next? Add the search form to the page. Let's do it. So the interesting thing about Angular is it separates out the logic. Like in React, your view, your template was inside of the component itself. Here, our view is just this HTML file, and our component is defined in this TypeScript file. So in here is where I'm going to add the form, and I'll grab that again from vanilla just to save some time. So that's going to go there. Let's see what we get. We get a basic form, no errors in the console. We're doing good. So we have added the search form to the page. Now, update state when input changes. Angular has a pretty cool way to do this, and it essentially is two-way data binding. So instead of having to manually hook up the change listener like we did with React, there is a built-in way of listening for changes on an input. And for that, we're going to go to the docs. So I believe if I search for ng model, let's take a quick break. Ooh. This is fun. Are you having fun? I'm having fun. I think this is kind of the first time I did this myself, where literally exact same app side by side. I think the last thing I want to do after I finish Angular and then Vue, I'm getting excited because Vue is going to take me like 5 minutes, but once I finish, I want to put them all side by side, see like what are the real differences between them all. Let's look up forms, form, concepts, quick reference. This is the one thing I don't like about Angular. There's so much in their documentation. It's really hard to find things. And there's also like, what I'm about to show is a way to do automatic data binding. You can also do it without that, and it doesn't seem that in their docs that the way to use that is easily findable. I'm familiar with Angular 1, which had this built-in thing called ng model, and this page is new. Or at least last time I tried Angular, this didn't happen, but this shows you like how you would do something in Angular 1 versus how you would do it now in Angular 6. But the way to do it is with the banana in the box. So in Angular, two-way binding is denoted by brackets, parentheses, descriptively referred to as a banana in a box. So we're going to add our banana in a box to point to search term. We can find that in ng model two-way binding to form elements. Okay, so first thing we need to do is bring in the forms module. So I'm going to grab the forms module, and this is going to go in our app module file. So in app.module, I'm going to bring in forms, and then we need to put forms on our imports. So now our application has access to ng model. Next thing is we can now use the banana in the box syntax. So this is basically what I want to do on my Vue. So on the input, I'm going to specify that. But the value that I want to bind to, I can name it whatever I want. I'm going to call this search term. And essentially whatever is inside of the double quotes here refers to some property on my component. So on my component, I'm going to set search term to initially be just an empty string. Cool. But the cool thing about this is now, after adding that, the search term is automatically getting updated under the hood by default. So if I were to try to render that out, we should see, as I start typing, you'll notice it's getting rendered out. So just by importing that forms module, adding it, and then putting the banana in the box on our input, we now have that two-way data binding where it's hooked up to our component properties. Cool. So now we are updating state when the input changes. Next thing, make an API request with the search term when the form is submitted. Okay, for this, we're going to want to use an Angular service. So let's figure out how to create a service. Actually, earlier I had a really hard time finding it in the docs, but if you just search for Angular 5 service or Angular generate service. Here, this is a good wiki for the Angular CLI. If you go to the generate page, it has all of the different things that you can generate using the CLI tool. And a service is one of the things that we want to generate. You can think of a service as a place to store information that you want to access in multiple components across your app. It's also a place where API requests should happen. And yeah, that's the main thing. So we're going to create a service, and we're going to use the CLI to generate our API service. And actually, let me also find, well, actually, we'll look for HTTP client. Yes. Okay. So we'll have to add this HTTP client module, and then it's showing us code that we're going to need to add to a service. But let's go ahead and generate that service before we do that. Typically, you give your service a descriptive name. They're calling theirs config service, so I'm going to call mine images service. So npx no. So we want to say generate service, and then we'll call this images service. Well, actually, I think I'll just call this images. I think it automatically adds the word service on the end. Go. Cool. And you'll notice it tells you where it put it. So inside of the source directory, inside of app is images.service. Let's take a look at that. So we now have our image service, and we want this to make the API request. So if we look at the docs, first thing we need to do is pull in the HTTP client module. Whoa, now, go back. Cool. So in the same place where we brought in the forms module, we're going to bring in the HTTP client module. Okay. Now we add that module as our imports. Great. Now, inside of our service, we bring in HTTP client. And the HTTP client has methods on it like get, post, put, delete. It's essentially a way of making API requests. So we have that. And now in our service, we will import it. And our constructor for our service will inject the HTTP client. So Angular has a concept called dependency injection. Basically, you define what dependencies your service or component has, and whenever Angular creates an instance of that service or an instance of that component, it decides what it should inject or pass into your constructor. So we're telling it we want the HTTP client. Great. Now we actually want to I guess we also need to make this thing inject. Oh, it already is injectable. That's good. And so now we actually want to make that API request. So in their example, they're just getting a JSON file with JSON data. But in our case, we want to do this, but we can call it whatever we want. So our method is going to be called search. It should take in the search term, and then just return this .http.get, and then we're going to define API URL on the service. So let me grab that. And then on the images service, we're going to add just a property called API URL. Exceeds maximum length. I don't care. I'm not going to try to fix that. So our images service can have properties on it just like our components can. So we specify the API URL property. And then when we call the search function of the images service, it will get the search term, and then it needs to make a request to that URL. So let's say URL is this.API URL, and the term is search term. Cool. And now we just want to make a request against that URL. Awesome. So we have this service. It makes a request to the API in this function called search. Now, how do we use it? So inside of the component, you can get access to the service. And we need to actually inject the service. Can I see an example of that? Inject. The dependency injection pattern. Let's actually look up service in the docs to see if they have an example there. Introduction to services and dependency injection. Okay, so let's say you have a service defined like that, and you want to get it into your component. So this is our hero service. On our component constructor, we need to inject it. So inside of app.component, we're going to need a constructor that accepts a service. And we don't want the hero service, we want the images service. So we need to import that. From images.service. Cool. And we'll do that. So, and this is the TypeScript syntax for there will be a property on my component called service that is of type images service. So let's actually call this images service. Cool. Now we need to actually tell it that it's injectable. Yeah, so in our app.module, we need to specify the service as a provider. So we'll do that. If you go to app.module, inside of here, we'll need to import our images service. There we we go. And then images service now goes inside of providers. And basically this tells Angular that, hey, here's this images service. And if anyone else asks for this thing to be injected, that's what we want to use. So that works like that. And yeah, and you can inject it at either level. You can either put it as a provider on the app module or put it as a provider on the component itself. I'm just putting it on the app module, which means it's available to any component inside of my app. Okay, so we have our images service. Now we need a submit function so we can actually call the service. So let's look at ng submit AngularJS to Angular concepts. Let's look up submit. Let's just look at forms. Submit, yeah, submitting the form with ng submit. So let's see, the user should be able to submit this form after filling it in. So on the form itself, we say ng submit, and then the name of the function or the method that we want to call inside of our component. So in our app component, we'll say on submit. And for now, let's just log form submitted. And now inside of our Vue, on the form, we'll say ng submit is on submit. So when this form is submitted, call the function on my component called on submit. That will get called here, and this should log to the console. So let's try it. Something's broke. Unexpected token. Oh, wait, what? In our app module. Oh, I misspelled from images service. Cool. Hard refresh. There we go. No errors. So if I say hello world, oh, actually, let's get rid of that binding real quick. We don't want that anymore. So in our template, get rid of the search term. Hello world, submit the form submitted. Cool. So now that function is getting called when the form is submitted. Let's contact our API. So here is where we can actually use the HTTP client. So we want to call it like this. And the interesting thing about this is the HTTP client is actually an observable. So instead of using something like a .then on a promise, you use a subscribe, which basically you can subscribe for data, and that will get called anytime new data is available. So we're going to follow this pattern, but inside of our onSubmit. So we'll say this dot images service dot search, and then we need to pass in this dot search term to call it. And then we're going to just subscribe to, let's just call this result. Cool. And then let's just log result. Let's see what happens. So now when the form is submitted, we're going to call the search method that we defined on our service, pass in the search term, get back the result, log it to the console. Where are we? Here we are. All right, puppies, please, broken. Images service dot search is not a function. I thought it was. Let's look at our images service. Search is there. Let's take a quick break. Let's see. If I look back at that example, git config is defined on the image service. In our component file, we are bringing in images service. In our app module, we are bringing in images service and specifying it as a provider. Are you sure about that, Angular? Let's see. It's not a function, error content. Yeah, let's just log the image service and see what we have access to. It is an empty object. It isn't inherits from ng injectable. Super interesting. Why are those properties not defined on my service? Let's see. Do I have any other errors besides this linter error? Let's see. All right, let's double check the docs for defining a service. Singleton services. I guess that's kind of what I want. So I have export class user service, export class images service. And in our app module, we are importing it in. That's working. Yeah, let's look at this. Introduction to services and dependency injection. So in their example here, they have a service class called logger that has 3 methods on it: log, error, and warning. And so in the chat, they're saying after export class, after the curly braces? So this is defining a class with a constructor. Maybe post a fuller example if you can explain a little bit more. Let's see. If we look at our component, because this is exporting a class defined as a class with its constructor, and then we're doing constructor. Actually, no, that should be okay. I was thinking this class might need to. I think I do have it after constructor. Is that not? Oh, on my app component? Oh no, I got it there too. Because at least from what I've seen, yeah. So your constructor can just have like an empty parentheses. Because on my component, I've got empty parens. And it is getting access to the images service. The images service just doesn't have any properties on it, which is curious. I had this working earlier. I don't know what I did any different. Let's see. We are bringing in, let's look again at HTTP client. So bringing in HTTP client module, that should be in my app.module. Is it under imports? Yep. And then inside of the service, bring in HTTP client and injectable, which I'm doing. And then they have like a super simple class config service that has the constructor. I mean, let's just copy it, make sure I'm not doing anything weird. Cool. I mean, I don't think that's messing with anything. And then, yeah, this is saying inside of the service, you can just define a property, and then you can define your method. So I do have search there, taking in search term. and it's returning HTTP GET, which is an observable. And then in our app component, onSubmit is on the component itself. Let's try again. Hard refresh. I literally changed nothing. All I did was a hard refresh. Oh, okay. Sorry about all the debugging, but I think it should work now. Jeez. Okay. It worked. So we're getting back data from the API. Okay, cool. I literally did not change anything. Like I don't know why that was happening. It could have been that I needed a hard refresh, but it's supposed to be refreshing for me. Regardless. Okay, where were we? We are now making the request. We got back the data. Now we actually want to store that on our component itself. So let's say images is an array. And then we'll say, when we get back the data, this dot images will be result dot photos. Cool. I'm getting type checking errors. Property photos does not exist on type object. I could define an interface. Oh, you think I renamed HTTP when it was passed in? Let me double check. I think I can probably Command Z it to see it. Let's see. I don't know. Oh, crap. Doesn't seem like it, but I wouldn't put it past myself because it's definitely possible. And made the call to this.http when it was named something else? Possibly. I'll go back and watch the video and see what I actually did. Okay, so because we're getting back this result from the API, we probably should define an interface that describes like what is the data we're getting back from the API, but I don't want to do that. So in TypeScript, there is also the any type, and that basically just says this can be anything, and now I don't have to actually define my types. I'm only doing this because I've spent a long time on Angular, and there's a lot going on in Angular, so we're gonna leave it as the any type. Here's what we're doing. On our component, we're defining images as an array. That's a property. And then when we get back our data, we're setting it on this.images. Now we actually want to show these images on the page in the component. So in our component, let's do, and actually we also want to show our loading. If we go back to our README, so we're making the API request, awesome. We should show the loading image before we actually show the results on the page. So in here, let's also have a loading property that is initialized to false. And then when you submit the form, we'll set this.loading to true. And then now we want to show that loading image inside of our component. And by the way, thanks Malari for debugging with me. I don't know if I've seen you in the chat before, but thanks for stopping by. And let's just grab our loading image that we already had. And we'll put this inside of our app component. So right below the form, we're going to throw that image. And then let's just add a basic style in styles.css. We'll set image to have 100% width. Cool. So now by default, when the page loads, we see that loading image. We want to hide that though, based on loading. So in Angular, there is a thing called ngIf, and it allows you to do conditional rendering. I always forget the syntax because I'm so used to Angular 1, which is ng-if. So in Angular 6, it is this. So basically, I want to say only show this loading image if loading is true. And so now, by default, when the page loads, there is no loading image. And then if I start to make a search, we see the loading image. And then now we will hide the loading image when we get back the result. We'll show the results on the page. So let's add a section, give it a class of images, And inside of here is where we want the images to go. But for this, we want to repeat over that array. So we have our array of images on our component. And inside of the view, we basically want to say, for that array, show every element, show an image for every element in that array. And for that, we can use ng4. So ng4 says let image in images. So the thing on the right-hand side is whatever the property name is inside of your component. So that's the array itself. And then the thing on the left-hand side, you can name it whatever you want, but you're basically saying for everything in this array, give it the name image. Now on this image, we have access to, on this image, we have access to this image. And now we can set the source. So I can do source equals image.image URL at 0. And in Angular, if you want an attribute to use something from your component, or you want it to be an expression, you have to put that in handlebars. So now we broke something. ng4, I might have gotten that wrong. Let's look up ng4. Whoa, 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 whoa. Oh, movie of. Tried to do it from memory. Image of images. Cool. Shalom. This channel is gold. I appreciate that. Thanks for watching. Okay. Let image of images. Cool. Now, we should hide the loading when we get back the images. So we'll set the images and then we'll say this dot loading equals false. Okay. We got there. It took us a while, but let's see what happens. Puppies. Search. Loading, and they're the puppies. Yay. Cool. Let's do some basic styling to put them into multiple columns. So images will have a column count of 3. And now if we search for kittens, there they are. Look at them. Awesome. Yeah, one thing we want to do though is the next time we make a search, we want to clear out the array because otherwise the results will appear below the loading image. So if I search for a beta fish, the kitten results were still there. So for that, before we make the request, we need to set this.images back to an empty array so that while it's making the request, the previous results go away. That should work. Dogs. There they are. And if we look at cats, you notice the dogs were gone for a second and then everything else shows up. Wow. Angular, we did it. All right, let's look at our checklist. So we showed the loading image, we appended the results to the page, and we hid the loading image. Whew. All right, I'm gonna do a quick rundown of what we just did with Angular, and then I'll get into Vue.js, the very last one we're gonna do tonight. I anticipate that Vue.js is going to take me 10 minutes at most. Maybe even 5. We'll see though. Okay, but let's review what we did here with Angular before we go too far. All right, so our app kind of starts in our HTML. We have this app root element that is defined by our app component, and whenever Angular sees this, it knows to load our app component into that. We have our app module, and this is essentially a container for all of the other components in our app. Right now, we only have one component, but if we had other components, they would live inside of this module. Our component is the one being rendered on the page, and its selector says app root, so that's where it's basically saying when you see an element with this name, that's what should show up on the page. And then our component is split up into 3 parts. You have the component itself, that's all of the state and methods. You have the view or the template, and that is just an HTML file with some special syntax to grab data from state. And then you have CSS to be applied for just this component. And that right now is just an empty file. I don't have any specific CSS for this component. And on a component, it's a class, and any properties you defined are essentially like the state of this component. So these are the properties that we're going to be updating based on certain user interactions, and these are the properties we're using inside of the view. So we have a title, we have a search term, this represents what the user is typing in, we have whether or not we're loading results, and then we have an array of images. If we look in the view, we use handlebars to render out that title. We use the banana in a box to bind the input to the search term. So this syntax here basically says whatever the user is typing into that input box should be bound back to the search term property. And then when this form is submitted, it calls on submit inside of the component. This sets loading to true, clears out any current results, and then calls our images service. So in Angular, whenever you want to share data between components, or make API requests, or have maybe some shared logic, typically that goes in a service. So we defined a service called images service. It brings in the HTTP client, and this is built into Angular, just a way for making API requests. So HTTP has .get, .post, .put, .delete. You can do all those different things. For our case, we just wanted to do a GET request. And on our service, we defined a search method where you pass in the search function, call it with your API URL and the current search term, and then return the call to the API. Back in the component, when we get back the results, we set it on images and we set loading to false. Inside of the component, we are using this ng-for syntax to iterate over the images, and we're using ng-if to decide whether or not to display the image. One of the main things I had to do is in app.module, to get ng model working, and I believe ng submit, I had to bring in the forms module, and then to be able to use the HTTP client, I had to bring in the HTTP client module. Whew. This is Angular. Cool. Now, the moment you've all been waiting for, I'm sure, Vue.js. Here we come. We waited so long. I did it last on purpose, but yeah. All right. So I'm just gonna take a quick break. That was a lot. We implemented an Angular app. That was a lot. Let's kill it in the terminal. Let's close that. Clear it out. Go out of the Angular directory. Okay. So for this Vue app, I'm going to use the Vue CLI 3. To use that, you can do npx @vue/CLI. It'll break if it doesn't. I think that's the way to do it. And then you say create, and then the name of the app you want to create. So I'm going to do Vue image search. Go. Check my messages. What a cliffhanger. This is my break timer. I am going to take a quick stretch. If you've been sitting down at home for this whole stream, you should stand up right now. Just stand up, get the blood flowing. Cool. All right, so the Vue CLI tool gives you lots of options. These are some of my pre-configured options that I've done before, but you can also go to manually select features and then choose what you want to have inside of your app. So for this, it's going to be a basic app. I did have those stretch features. I'm not going to do them. I've already been streaming for 2 hours. So what we want is just basic linting, and that's it. We'll do Airbnb, lint on save, and lint and fix on commit. We'll put all of our configs inside of the package.json. And we will not save it as a preset. Dan, are you saying it's a cliffhanger because I waited to do Vue.js all the way to the end? I think it was an interesting decision because it's either like watch Vue.js and see how awesome it is, and then watch me struggle through all these other frameworks, or see it happen with those and then see me do it with Vue.js in like 5 minutes. Can someone start a timer? Actually, I'll start a timer. I'm going to time myself after it's generated. So after you ran that command, that created a folder with your Vue.js app inside of it. You can do npm run serve. That'll start it up. And this is an auto-refreshing hot reloading dev server. So the cool thing about hot reloading is if only one component changes or one file changes, only that part of your screen will update instead of the whole thing. So that's pretty cool. No errors. Let's get rid of all our Angular resources. Cool. All right, I will start a timer right now. Start a stopwatch. Go. Okay. If we look at our README, first thing is add the search form. Before I do that, I will do a quick tour. Got our basic folder. All of our Vue.js code is going to go inside of source. Public has a basic HTML file. It has a div called app. That's where our Vue.js app is going to live. Very similar to how React did it. If you look at main.js, this is the entry point. Basically, we're bringing in the Vue library. We're bringing in our app component, and then we're saying mount that app component on that app element. Great, that's how it works. Our app.vue has some basic stuff in it. I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to get rid of this hello world component. Get rid of that. Get rid of any default styles. And this is the interesting thing about a Vue.js component. Your template or your view, your script, and your style all exist inside of the same file, which is pretty awesome, I think. You might have different opinions on that, but I like the fact that everything I'm doing is all inside of one file. All right, first things first, let's add skeleton to our app. And we'll do that in public in the index.html. So we'll add that there. Great. Next thing is we'll add some basic styles. So this is the style that I want there. For app.vue, I'm just going to put those styles inside of that style tag there. By default, these are just going to be global styles, so that should apply to it. And then inside of my app component, I'm going to have an h1 that says view image search. What do we get? Ta-da! Cool. So next thing is I need a form. Let's grab that from our vanilla app. Not that. That. Need a form. And that's just going to go right below our put. Cool. First things first, let's get some state going on this component. In Vue, your state is known as data, and that is a function that returns an object. The first thing that we want to represent on state is the title, so let's do that. Vue.js uses handlebars template syntax to render things from your data. So I'm saying render the title right there, and on our data we'll have a property called title that is that value. Cool. Should that not be there? Oh. I thought my linter wanted trailing comments. We'll see. Okay, so that's there. It still works. We've got our basic form. Awesome. Let's look at the README. We want to, so we've added the search term. Now update state when the input changes. All right, so on my state, I need search term. And then inside of the template, I want to bind the input to that search term. It's kind of similar to Angular, except it involves less work. I don't have to import anything else. I can just do v-model and say search term. This automatically syncs it with my data. So to see that in action, if I add an h3 and put search term inside of there, now by default, I instantly am syncing with my data. Good to go. All right, next thing is make an API request with the search term when the form is submitted. So on the form, I want to listen to submit. In Vue, you do that with the @ sign. You can specify any event. I have a plugin inside of code that tells me all the different events. So I'm going to say submit. They have a lot of built-in helpers. One of them I'm going to use is .prevent. That automatically prevents the default action. And then you can specify what function you want to run when the form is submitted. So I'm going to say form submitted. Cool. Now on my component, I need this function. And on your component, you can define methods. That is an object. It can have any number of functions inside of it. I'm going to put form submitted there. And when the form is submitted, I'm just going to log this .search term. Cool. James True, he'll be back for the content. Just stopped by to say, CJ, you're a monster. Thanks, man. Thanks for stopping by. Cool. So when the form is submitted, let's log what the user typed into the form. So hello world, submit. It logged to the console. Let's also just get rid of that H3. I feel like I'm moving fast just because I want to finish quick, but I should slow down, explain things. All right, let's make that API request. We can grab this code from our vanilla app. It's going to be very similar. We are going to use fetch. So we need that. I could define this in a separate file just like I did with React. Actually, I'll do that. Let me just grab from our React app. I can copy this API file, and we'll just use that exact same API file inside of our Vue.js app. Cool. So now in here, I have this this file that exports an object, and I'm just going to import that into my component. So inside of here, I'm going to say import API from not form, API. Cool. So now this component has access to the API. And when the form is submitted, we will do API.search. We'll pass in this .search term. And we will .then it. We'll get access to the images. And then let's just log those out. King of Game in the chat says, what's up? What are you using? This is the very last one of the stream. Right now, I am doing it with Vue.js. We did it with Vanilla. We did it with React. We did it with Angular 6. This is the last one with Vue.js. Okay, so when the form is submitted, we call the API, and then we'll just log those images out to the console. So let's search for puppies. There's our data. Awesome. So we want to represent that data on state. So on our data, we'll say images. We'll set that equal to an empty array. And then inside of here, we want to set the images. So we'll just say this.images equals images. Great. I think, again, we want to show that loading image. So let's grab that from our vanilla app. Actually, we'll grab both these things because we want to do that. So in my Vue app, right below the form, there's my break timer. Let's take a quick stretch. Whew. Okay. So we have the image, but we only want to show this if we're loading. So first we need a loading property on our state. So we'll say loading is initially false. And then when we start to search the API, we'll say this.loading is true. And we only want to show this if loading is true. So Vue has a way to do that with v-if loading. So if loading is true, show that image. Let's see what we get. So if we search for kittens, loading, and we're not setting it to false yet, so it just shows up. Let's just add a basic 100% width style to our image. Cool. And you'll notice the page didn't fully refresh, and also all of my previous console logs there. That's because of this idea of hot reloading. Like, it's only changing the things that need to. It's not refreshing the entire page. Cool. So we now are showing it when we're loading images. Now we want to actually show those images on the page. So inside of here, I want an image, and the source, well, I want to repeat this image for every image inside of my images array. So for that, you have v4. And I think this is why I messed up the syntax earlier in Angular, because it's image in images. And so images is on our data. This, we can give it any property we want, but this refers to each image inside of that array. And then we can specify the source. So in Vue, to bind the value of an attribute, you use a colon, and then give it the value that you want. In this case, I want image.image URL at 0. And my linter is complaining because I need a key. So just like in React, Vue.js uses the virtual DOM, so it needs a key to keep track of each image. Image.id. Cool. All right, and then last thing is, after we get the images, we'll set this.loading to false. And when we first submit the form, we'll set this.images to an empty array so that before making the API request, the previous results clear out. All right, here we go. Puppies, go. There they are. Last thing is just a simple CSS style. So let's say dot images. We'll have a column count of 3. And there we go. Time, 10 minutes, 15 seconds. I need a sound. Cool. I did rush through that. I think I'll take my time to really explain it, because we're doing very similar things like we did with the other front-end frameworks, but to me, it feels like less code, and it just makes sense. I don't know. And it's doing a lot more for us than something like React, and has a lot less involved than something like Angular 6. King of Game is asking, what am I using to code on? Are you asking about my editor or my system? I mean, I'll give you that. If it's not that, clarify. I am using a MacBook Pro running OS X. My code editor is VS Code. I'm using a theme called Seti Monokai, and I have various other packages installed that give me nice little icons and things like that. And the framework that I'm coding in is Vue.js. So we finished. Let's check those boxes, and then let's just review how is this Vue.js application working. All right. First thing is the search form. Pretty basic. And if we look at our state, all of the state of our application is getting stored there on data. So you have the title of the page, what the current search term is, what the images are, and then whether or not we are loading. The search term starts off as an empty string, but with the vmodel directive, you can bind this input to your data. So anytime search term changes, the model is automatically being updated under the hood. And then we listen for the submit event of the form. Vue, to listen for DOM events on elements, you use the @ sign and then the name of the event. There are various helpers built in, but this one, .prevent, just prevents the default action. And we tell it which method we want to call when the form is submitted. And then on our methods, we have form submitted. Dan is saying, oh man, Final Fantasy music. I know you're where the rest of my night is going. Awesome. King of Game is asking, do I have Discord? I don't. I'm thinking pretty soon I will probably start some sort of forum or chat for the channel so that people can talk about my videos and maybe ask for help and stuff like that. But I don't have anything set up just yet. I'm getting very, very close to 1,000 subscribers. And so I think part of the celebration of 1,000 subs will be like setting up a forum. 920. I think I've gained 8 subs while the stream is going. That's awesome. But I'm getting really close, and yeah, definitely more things to come for the coding garden with CJ. And so when this method is called, we set loading to true. On our template, if loading is true, we show the image. So we see the loading image. We set images to an empty array. And when you read about Vue, you'll hear it being called, it is reactive, meaning the moment we change data, the Vue instantly updates. So you'll notice I'm not having to call set state or anything like that. I'm just updating the values, and then this will actually re-render our page according to the latest values of our data. So we show the loading image, we reach out to our API, and then when we get back the images, we set them. By setting them, this v4 now knows to iterate over that array. And we also set loading to false so that the loading image disappears. And then v4 just repeats that image for each one, and we show that image on the page. Awesome. Dan, I'll see you later. Yeah, fire up the RetroPie. That's awesome. Appreciate you for stopping by. That's it. That's Vue.js. All right, we did it. How long have I been streaming? 2 hours and 20 minutes. All right, let's take these last few minutes of the stream and reflect on the 3 different frameworks that we used. I did have some like stretch features in mind, but it took us a while to get everything going with the other frameworks. I will admit that Vue.js was last, so I did get to copy in some of the code we used from other ones, so that made it a little bit faster. But yeah, let's talk about it. So if we look at our vanilla app, it has the HTML just defined inside of the HTML file. There's really no built-in way of separating that out, which you see in the other frameworks. So for our HTML, this is our view, and then JavaScript is using DOM manipulation to get access to specific elements and then changes them. For React, we have a render function that returns a representation of our view. So if we look at it, yeah, so we're looking at JSX. It's essentially HTML inside of our JavaScript, but instead of just defining the HTML separately, we define our view in terms of our state. So we basically pick out what is the data associated with my app. You pull that out from the view, and then you represent your view according to whatever that state might be. And then changes happen, state gets updated, and then the view re-renders. If we look at Angular, it takes a similar approach to Vue. If we look at our app, we look at the component. Its view is an HTML file that has things referenced from our component properties. So things like loading, images, search term, onSubmit, all of those things are defined inside of our component. So that's the view. A few different approaches. Angular and Vue are fairly similar. And then let's look at the JavaScript. So in vanilla JavaScript, we are just doing everything by hand. So we're selecting specific elements, we're manually tapping into events, we're manually changing style properties, and then based on our logic, changing things up inside of the app. So up top, I'm storing references to all the elements on the page. And then when the form is submitted, we call our function, we prevent the default action, we grab the search term from the search input. And this is one of the key differences between like just vanilla JavaScript and a front-end framework. Typically in vanilla JavaScript, you're storing all of the state inside of the DOM. So like the value of the input only exists in the DOM. I'm not updating it on our state. And in every other front-end framework, we're actually updating our state every time the input value changes. So if we look at React, we have an onChange event on our input, and every time the input changes, we update state. Where's that? Yeah, we set state with the latest search term. And if we look at Angular, that's where we used ng model. So our state has an initial empty search term, and on the component, this ng model, anytime the input changes, it automatically updates state. And then in Vue, it has a similar directive called vmodel, and anytime the input changes, it updates state. So in all of the front-end frameworks, we're keeping track of everything in the UI as JavaScript, whereas in vanilla JavaScript, things are stored inside of the DOM and aren't necessarily stored in JavaScript. Rodrigo says, cool, thanks for tuning in. Brooks, time to head to bed, gotta get up early. Thanks for tuning in. And Chad says, Angular is so nasty. I agree. It just feels so convoluted and there's so many things you have to bring in and so many things that could go wrong. It feels like a mess, even compared to React, even compared to Vue. Yeah. So that's the search input. And then calling the API, again, if we look at vanilla, when we call the API, we can just use built-in fetch, but when we get back the results, we're then just storing those directly in the DOM. We're not really keeping track of them in JavaScript land. So we get back that array of images and then just append a bunch of new elements to the page. Whereas in React, we're storing that on state. So our initial state says images is an empty array. And then when we call the API, when we get back the images, we update state, and then React takes care of changing that on the view, or what the user actually sees. And inside of our render function, we simply just map over the array of images and return JSX, that is an image tag. So anytime this array changes, it'll just rerun that map function to create the latest images. If we look how we did it in Angular, it has that built-in ng4 directive, which basically allows you to say, give it a name of some property on your state. So in Angular, on the class instance, our images was a property on our component. And when we're referencing images in the template, we're referencing that directly. And then lastly, in Vue, similar style, on our data, we have an array of images, and it has a directive called v4 that lets us repeat over that array of images. And if the array changes, it automatically updates the repeating. Cool. I guess back to vanilla. I think the last thing would be like conditional rendering. So in vanilla, we wanted to be able to hide and show the loading image. So in our JavaScript, we're just directly grabbing the image. And then when we want to hide it, we set display none. And then when we want to show it, we remove that. So it's very manual. We're basically deciding when to show that. With React, we have a property on our state called loading. And if that is true, it will render the image. If it's false, it renders nothing. And so the way that works in the render function is just a ternary statement. So it says, if loading is true, show the image. Otherwise, show nothing. In Angular, they have the built-in directive ng-if. So if loading is true, show this image. Otherwise, don't show it. And in Vue, we have the v-if directive. So if loading is true, show this image. Otherwise, don't show it. Okay, I think I kind of covered all the different things. Let's look back at my README. User input, DOM events, API requests for conditional rendering, rendering list of data. We did all of these things in 4 different ways. You saw all of the different styles. I think that's it. I think that's it for the stream. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Thanks everyone for participating in the chat. This has been a great time. I'm going to push all of this code up to GitHub. I'll put the link in the description, and I'll also tweet it out if you follow me on Twitter. So if you go to twitter.com/coding_garden, you can follow me. Every time I go live, I tweet out. And yeah, you can also message me on there too if you'd like to. If you visit coding.garden, all of my upcoming stream times are on there. I am actually going to cancel the Thursday evening stream. I have a prior commitment, but I'll replace that with either a Friday or a Saturday stream. And to be notified of that, on my YouTube channel, I put all of my upcoming streams there. So you'll see if either a Friday or a Saturday stream pops up there. Cool. Rodrigo G, thumbs up. Thanks for tuning in. Yeah, and as mentioned, if you haven't followed yet or subscribed, please subscribe. You can click set reminder on any of the upcoming streams. I think that's it. I'm just going to play myself applause real quick. That's a little pretentious. I'm sorry. Boo. But I had a great time. It's super fun to think about like the different ways to build an app like this and how each framework approaches it in like a slightly different way. Cool. If you're watching this afterwards, throw in the comments below like what is your favorite framework? Which do you prefer out of all of these? And I think that's it. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'll see you next time. Here's this.